So Rafal, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. If not in person, at least we can meet. We can meet thanks to the technology. Please just tell me how much time do I have for it, because I can talk a lot, so you just need to stop me at some point.
I would say, I mean, we originally wanted to have like short inputs of 5 to 7 minutes. So if you go 7.5 or 8.5, 8:22, it's going to be perfectly fine. But don't extend it too much, so that we simply have enough time for the discussion where you can.
Exactly. Yes, that's important.
Should I give you a sign, Rafal? Like,
okay. That's good. That's good. Thank you. So I'm sorry I missed the first day of the discussions, but I really enjoyed the second day, and it was a source of satisfaction for me when I heard Ralph talking about the internationalization of nationalism, which is a phrase I have been using for about 2 decades now. And I think it was for the first time when I actually heard someone else using this phrase, which was a measure of my personal success, I felt. But of course, we know internationalization of the far right is not a new phenomenon, but certainly it intensified in the last years. And I would say that is actually one of the main tactics which they are using nowadays in terms of seeking legitimacy, not just on the national, but especially on the international level through international cooperation. And I want to tell you a little bit about Poland in this context, but let me start by using an example from Bosnia-Herzegovina, from Sarajevo, that I learned about when I last year, and I imagine many of you may have heard the story, but I thought that was an excellent exemplification of what we are talking about here, the globalization of extremism. I think it was May, so the first Gay Pride March in Sarajevo was already announced. It was planned, although it didn't take place until September, but it was already official. And football hooligans from the local clubs were already protesting against it months before. And of course, from Poland, we know very well this type of mobilization, using football as a tool, using football culture as a space, in opposition to LGBT rights initiatives. And as part of this anti-gay mobilization, they used the national flag of Brunei, which, of course, shortly before that had very harsh anti-gay legislation that was very controversial, across the world. And I thought that's incredible to use the national flag of Brunei in an Eastern European state. That really shows an impressive degree of globalization of hateful symbolism. In this case, I'm afraid the national flag of a Southeast Asian state was used as a hate symbol. And the only one similar case I could think of from Poland was when fans of one club abused fans of another Polish club using banners written in the Indonesian language, probably with the help of Google Translator, when one of the players of a Polish club was actually an Indonesian. But that story became a big scandal in Indonesia, and social media accounts of 2 Polish clubs were flooded by negative comments of tens of thousands of angry Indonesians protesting against the misusage of their own language in Poland. So when I went to Indonesia last year, I had something to talk about when it comes to the topic of internationalization of extremism. And I think many of us could find many other examples. But I would repeat again my thesis, my claim that internationalization is in fact one of the main tactics, one of the main tools for the far right anywhere in the world today, certainly in our region. Now, if we talk about Poland, back in the 90s and later, Poland was considered a kind of successful example of democratic transformation, a kind of successful example of transition. And the comparison was made many times with the Balkans. Beware of Balkanization. At least we are not like Romania. The transition was peaceful. Look at the former Yugoslavia. The lack of significant minorities in Poland was actually often mentioned as a plus. As one of the factors that contributed to the supposedly successful and peaceful transformation. And I think today, more than ever, we are able to see the weakness of that kind of perspective on the Polish transition. And I think it's not a secret. Since 2015, we have seen a very dramatic crisis of the democratic culture in Poland and the democratic values, and I think there are not many moments when we can point to a specific moment in time when things were changing really rapidly in front of our eyes, and that was the summer of 2015. So I'm not even talking about the election in Poland that took place in the autumn of that year. But I'm talking about the European refugee crisis, which, as we know well, didn't have any direct impact on Poland because few of the refugees were even interested in going to Poland, and almost none of them did. But that was portrayed in the media discourse and in the political discourse as a threat to Polish identity, which I would say was a completely artificially created threat. So the construction of the enemy happened in front of our very eyes in a way that was quite significant, and we saw immediately the impact that that political discourse, the elite discourse, has on social attitudes and awareness, and the attitudes changed dramatically. There is a lot of sociological data showing how quickly and how dramatically the attitudes changed. Not just on the issue of refugees, but on the issue of diversity and tolerance in the broadest sense. And again, I think I would just briefly allude to what was said previously. It became difficult, if not impossible, to tell the difference between the discourse of the far right and the discourse of mainstream political parties. And I think since 2015, it has become even more problematic to distinguish. And again, not just on the refugee issue, but on many other issues, including gay rights, but also including the discussion about anti-Semitism, which I would say made a very spectacular comeback in Poland through the far right, the new far right group, Konfederacja, which is now present in the Polish parliament and criticizes the Polish ruling party from the right. It's possible, believe it or not, but the language of the far right, also on on the matter of so-called Jewish claims was basically copied and repeated during this year's presidential campaign by the sitting president. And I would say, just like we could talk about Islamophobia without the Muslims, because the Muslim community in Poland is very, very small nowadays. Although it actually has a long history going back to the Middle Ages, but we are talking about, you know, maybe 20,000 people in a country of almost 40 million. Similarly, the phenomenon of anti-Semitism without Jews again became a feature of the Polish political discourse, and it was reintroduced to Polish politics by this new far-right group, and through their presence in parliament in particular. So once again, I would say the lack of minorities clearly, or the lack of significant minorities in Polish society clearly is not a problem for the far right, because the enemy can always be created, it can always be constructed. In fact, you might argue it is actually easier to mobilize and campaign against a non-existing group rather than a group that is actually numerically significant, because a small minority is socially weaker, and therefore, as a target, it becomes more vulnerable. And maybe I'm probably over time now, but my last point, again related to the construction of enemy, especially Islamophobia without the Muslims, but also the other types, and internationalization. I think there is no better symbol of that than the annual march that takes place in Warsaw on the 11th of November, which is the national holiday of Poland, commemorating the independence of Poland from 1918. Over the years, it has become the biggest far-right event probably anywhere. It started about 10 years ago from a small group of about 500 young people with nationalist and xenophobic slogans, and every year it became bigger. By now, it has around 200,000 participants every year. So the scale is very significant, and also it became the biggest international far-right event. And if you watch it, it looks like a dictionary of the far right from all over Europe and beyond, because also American groups started participating in it. And interestingly, there are far-right groups that normally are even in conflict with each other. So, for example, Slovak groups and Hungarian groups, and Ukrainian and Russian groups, and so on. They still manage to participate in this one event in Warsaw, which provides them with a kind of platform that is unique. But it also shows the kind of flexibility of their political identity, and I think in itself it also shows the growing importance of the internationalization of the phenomenon. And thank you for your patience. I will maybe stop now, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Rafal. I mean, precisely this point, the construction of the other and of the enemy. I mean, that became really paradigmatic following the so-called refugee and migration crisis. I mean, we all know that Orban was running campaigns, electoral campaigns to 2018 with no refugees and migrants whatsoever in Hungary, and that's basically a kind of a new phenomenon, post-factual. So beyond that facts, you don't even need the small minorities. You don't need them at all. and you just run the campaign. And now, I mean, just going back to Austria, I mean, this is what Foreign Minister said, basically. I mean, the general and average Austrian population is full of fears of those guys sitting in Moria and not having a place to sleep. But they are so far away. So this is very important. In mentioning politics of fear, we will probably touch upon it. This always goes hand in hand. I mean, this kind of a construction of the other and the emotional environment climate that you create around it. So thanks a lot, Rafal. Now we fly quickly. Zoom is really good for flying from Poland to Romania.